Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us here on Press TV's Top 5. And now, Turkish opposition figure Fethullah Gulen has denied any involvement in the country's attempted coup. The U.S.-based Islamic cleric said the attempted overthrow may have been staged even. Exiled Muslim cleric called on Turkish people not to see military intervention in a positive light. Meanwhile, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has called on the U.S. to extradite Gulen.
Whichever terrorist you asked us to extradite, we have given to you. We hope that you will give us this person who happens to be on our terror list, our strategic files.
Erdogan made the comments in the presence of his supporters. In the meantime, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says Washington has not received any official extradition requests from the Turkish government. Meanwhile, in a phone conversation with Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, Kerry said claims of Washington's role in the attempted coup are, quote, utterly false. He added that such insinuations are harmful to bilateral ties. See, earlier, Turkish Labor Minister Süleyman Soylu accused the U.S. of being behind the coup. And for more of the story, we're joined out of Richmond by Mr. James Jatras, former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst. Mr. Jatras, welcome to the program, sir. Although the U.S. has stood behind Erdogan's administration throughout this coup and is a close NATO ally, we now see a Turkish minister accusing Washington of involvement in this coup. Where do you think that accusation comes from, and how will it affect Turkey-U.S. ties?
Well, it could come from a couple of places. To start with, Gulen is here in the United States. He is reputed to have a long-standing relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. I don't know if that is true or not. And also, it comes right after we see these moves toward rapprochement between Ankara and Moscow, which is something that may not be welcome in Washington. So that might fuel the speculation. Now, of course, Gulen himself accuses Erdogan of staging the coup as a provocation, as an excuse to seize even more power, and he promises he will fight any extradition request, and I believe Mr. Kerry has suggested that any request would have to be supported with proof. So I think things are very unclear now what is going on.
But, you know, the labor minister, Süleyman Soylu, accused the U.S. of being behind the coup. I want to know what you think that stemmed from, that accusation.
I think it's circumstantial as far as I can tell at this point. If they have some other proof that the United States was behind it, I'm sure they will bring that forward. I'm certainly not discounting the accusation, but I think they'll need more than just circumstantial evidence.
I got you. And now with the coup attempt failed, or defeated, I should say, who do you think has benefited from it most, both inside and outside Turkey?
The general consensus is that Erdogan has become even more powerful, and rather ironically, because he's saying, I'm the elected leader, this is democracy, but he may be close now to seizing what amounts to total power in Turkey, which may have been his aim all along. There are some people that suggest that maybe he has been weakened somehow, but frankly, I don't see it. I think that he is emerging from this more powerful than ever.
And what could be the short-term and long-term effects of this coup when it comes to Turkey's foreign policy in the region?
I think the short-term effect will be, does he continue with his move towards rapprochement with Moscow? He's also reestablished relations with Israel. He's even talked about reestablishing ties with Syria. Will Turkey pull back from its support from terrorist groups in Syria? I think that's the big question right now.
And last but not least, I want to go back to the actual coup plotters. What do you think got them infuriated up to the point where this small faction of military personnel decided to stage this coup? What backed them into that corner, in your view?
There's a lot of speculation here in the United States that this is somehow the old secular Kemalist military establishment reasserting itself. And frankly, I find that hard to believe, because that element has been so purged from the Turkish armed forces by Erdogan. If indeed Gulen was behind this, this could be a competing faction with an Islamist agenda, but we really don't know that. Until we find out who the individuals are specifically, and frankly the trials begin and we get some more evidence, who is behind it, we'll get a better sense of what their aims were.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. So I guess the next few days, weeks, and months will prove to be crucial in finding out more to this story. That was Mr. James Jotras. Thank you for your contribution, former U.S. Senate foreign policy analyst, joining us out of Richmond. And now French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve says the country is set to call up the reserves to relieve tired security forces after a deadly attack in the city of Nice.
La décision a été prise de faire appel à la réserve opérationnelle.
The decision has been taken to call up the operational reserves for the National Police and Gendarmerie. This mobilization of the operational reserves, which can only take place in summer during the reserve's holidays, will allow the prefecture from now and in each area to use a rapidly mobile resource of 12,000 volunteers, 9,000 for the National Gendarmerie and 3,000 for the police.
Now, he called on all volunteer citizens to join the reservists to help boost security, as some 26,000 out of over 200,000 reserve forces in France are expected to be called up. According to French defense officials, the addition of reservists should enable the country's forces to deal with simultaneous operations. Now, this comes as 5 children and 21 adults are still fighting for their lives after that Nice truck attack. A truck driver slammed into a crowd of people celebrating Bastille Day and killed 84 people before being shot dead by police. And now we're going to swing over to Mr. Joe Quinn out of Paris to get more on the story. Editor and researcher at SOTT.net, that's SOT.net. Now, Mr. Quinn, why has France been such a repetitive target, do you think, for these tragic attacks? I'm sure there's a question boggling many minds.
Well, France is the highest population of Muslims in any European country. So for those people who have an agenda to demonize Muslims and to set the West against the Muslim world and people in Muslim countries, particularly in the Middle East, France is an obvious target for stoking that kind of fracture point where you could kind of create the reality in a certain sense, or they would like to create the reality of Muslims being seen as terrorists by the West, because that simply furthers their long-term, and here I'm talking about Western powers, it furthers their long-term agenda of controlling the Middle East. And if they want to control the Middle East, they have to be directly involved in it with their militaries. And to justify that, they have to have people in Western countries believe Muslims, all Muslims if possible, believe all of them to be terrorists, which makes invading Muslim countries more easy.
France did indeed support the invasion of Syria and the opposition, the foreign-backed opposition in, or I should say militants, operating in Syria. And a bunch of French citizens, I'm pretty sure, actually went and fought in Syria. Many have returned to France. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. There's been a very clear French involvement in supporting the Western war on Syria, on the Syrian people, effectively, to try and get rid of Bashar al-Assad. And of course, this ties in very directly with the general Western kind of renewal of the Cold War, effectively led by the US against Russia. Because, of course, as everybody knows, Assad has thrown his lot in or has sided with Russia, and Russia has a lot of strategic interests in Syria, and in Syria remaining kind of as independent from Western power as possible. So, and of course, France was also directly involved in the bombing campaign against Libya. So these are all part of Western foreign interventions that have the goal of controlling largely oil resources and gas resources, and also about keeping Russia out of the global game effectively, and maintaining particularly US dominance in the world. And of course the EU, and France being part of the EU, has historically been aligned with the US. So the US is on first here and has been for many decades, and the EU is following suit. But I think there may well be factions at the same time, factions within France who are increasingly reluctant to play along with the US agenda, because it hurts France's own interests and the interests of other European countries, you know.
And with this horrible track record that France's intelligence community has had over the last 18 months now, What will this deployment of reservists now do to change things? I mean, will having a heavy military presence throughout the streets not just be more terrorizing for the public?
Well, absolutely. It'll terrorize the public, and it will set, obviously, the agenda here. The focus will be on Muslims in France, of which there are about 6 million, because they have, as I said, they have been demonized over the past 15 years, particularly since 9/11, by Western countries. So these people, these reservists who are being called up, are obviously going to have that in their minds because they've been propagandized against for the past 15 years against Muslims in a very dangerous situation, not just for Muslims in France, but for the entire French population, because, I mean, you're talking about something that could be pushed towards a kind of civil war or a reenactment almost of the Nazi Germany kind of scenario where a section of the population the Muslims today in France could end up being like the Jews during the Second World War.
And then one more thing, how do you think this is going to affect all these attacks, added on top of one another? How do you think it's going to ultimately affect France's foreign policy in the Middle East?
Well, it's going to be used by those powers within France that have the kind of NATO or aligned with the NATO agenda, the US agenda of continuing aggressive involvement and aggressive military involvement in the Middle East, to control the Middle East. Again, as I said, to keep back Russia. This is largely a geopolitical war against Russia. So, I mean, they're going to continue. They're going to use this. They use every attack like this, for whatever the origin of it is. There are definitely certain elites in France who will use it to basically fill their own pockets, to enrich themselves through further meddling in and warmongering in Middle Eastern countries. So it's not looking good.
And last but not least, sorry, I have one more question. Does this surprise you as odd that Francois Hollande is still the president of the country? He's had a lot of terrorist attacks take place under his watch, yet somehow he still hasn't stepped aside. He still hasn't been pressured to step aside. Why is he still the president of the country?
Well, he's the president of the country because he was elected on false pretenses, I suppose, as most presidents of Western countries are. They lie or they present themselves as something they aren't. But like most French presidents, certainly over the past few decades, Francois Hollande has very little power in France. He's really it's a ceremonial position. The guy obviously isn't. He's regularly derided by many French people. He's not a popular president. He's very ineffective, and he's little more than a puppet, really, for people behind the scenes in France, and that's true in many Western countries as well. So I think the people in France are looking forward to elections, the upcoming elections in France next year, to get rid of Francois Hollande, but I'm not very hopeful that there'll be anybody better offered to them as their new quote-unquote president.
Thank you, Mr. Joe Quinn, for your input. That's Mr. Joe Quinn joining us, out of Paris, editor and researcher at SOTT.net. And now thousands of Britons have marched through London in protest against a rise in racism and attacks on refugees throughout the nation. Protesters came together to show their frustration at the growing number of refugees being targeted. Our correspondent Mohammed Walji has spoken to some of the demonstrators.
On Saturday, thousands of Britons from across the country converged onto central London to show their disapproval of the rise of racism and attacks on refugees in Britain. Since the UK voted to leave the European Union in late June, hate crimes have surged 42% in England and Wales, with a significant number of the attackers targeting refugees. Between only the 16th and 30th of June, over 3,000 incidents of hate crime were reported. That's nearly 3 times from the same period last year.
With rising xenophobia and Islamophobic hate crimes, coupled with a struggling economy filled with austerity measures, protests like this have become common.
According to the demonstrators, refugees have become the scapegoat for the UK's problems, and some of the key communities targeted have been the Polish and the Muslims. A refugee centre in North London was hit with racist graffiti urging Poles to go home, Leaflets were even posted to Polish households with racist abuse.
I think it's appalling. I think it's very frightening. I think it's very worrying. We've worked for years and years and years, since the 60s and 70s, to try and combat racism and get a society where that does not exist.
It's more and more often that these things are happening now, the attacks and the comments and the looks. You see it on public transport in London every single day.
They whip it up. It's part of they like to scapegoat immigrants, say it's all the immigrants' fault for unemployment, the housing crisis.
Governments themselves want to create disharmony, and they'll give any sort of publicity that creates unrest and makes people feel uncomfortable and do things that they shouldn't do.
We cannot allow this nonsense anymore.
Attacks against refugees are becoming more and more common. And some of those protesting today are fearful that unless it's tackled now, it will become the norm. Mohammed Walji, Press TV, London.
Yemen's Ansarullah movement and allied army units have inflicted heavy casualties on forces loyal to the former regime in the province of Taiz. Yemeni fighters fired a ballistic missile at a military base in Bab al-Mandab region, leaving some 180 people dead, including mercenaries. The attack comes as Saudi forces' artillery shelling of a village in Taiz province earlier killed at least 9 civilians, among them women and children. The attacks also caused massive material damage and wounded many people. Locals say Saudi forces and their mercenaries prevented ambulances from reaching the injured. More than 9,500 Yemenis, mostly civilians, have lost their lives since the beginning of Riyadh's onslaught in March of 2015. Now, Syrian army forces have taken control of a strategic town in Latakia province. Government forces captured the town of Kinsaba after heavy clashes with foreign-backed militants. Army is also taking control of Shalaf and Tubal castles and several strategic hilltops. The Syrian army has been fighting foreign-backed militants since 2011. It's pledged to press ahead with its counter-terror operations until it drives all terrorists out of the country. And earlier we were joined by our Damascus-based correspondent Muhammad Ali to get the latest on Syrian army gains in the fight against terrorists.
The Syrian army, in cooperation with national defense units, managed to fully take control of Knesba town. This is a town northeast of Latakia city. Of course, we have to note that terrorists infiltrated to that town last month. However, the Syrian army was able to regain control of it, in addition to a large areas around it, and also 2 main castles, along with strategic hilltops. Of course, the area over there in Latakia countryside is a mountainous area, so every hilltop is a strategic area for the side which controls it for next battles over there. Also, the importance of controlling Knesba is that it is adjacent to the provincial borders with Idlib governorate, which of course would enable the Syrian army to carry on and press ahead with its operations towards the Idlib countryside. Particularly the closest area there where terrorists are controlling is Jisr al-Shughur. Also, Knesba is very close to the borders with Turkey, and this would also enable the Syrian army perhaps to pressure those terrorists who are infiltrating from Turkey. So definitely a very important advance for the Syrian army, and also we have to point out that it came after ferocious clashes with terrorists, mainly Al-Nusra Front and other groups that joined forces with it. And that's it, everyone, for your Press TV's Top 5. Thank you for joining us here on Press TV World News, and bye-bye for now.